You're reading someone right now, and they have no idea. You see through them like glass, picking up on contradictions they don't even know they're broadcasting. And when you try to explain how you know what you sound absolutely insane. Here's what nobody tells you about being an INTP who just knows things. Your brain isn't magical. It's not mystical. What you're experiencing is pattern recognition operating at a speed that bypasses your conscious awareness. Your mind processes thousands of microsignals, behavioral inconsistencies, and contextual clues in fractions of a second, then delivers the conclusion without showing you the work. That's why you can't explain it. That's why people think you're guessing. That's why you second guess yourself even when you're right. But the real problem isn't that you know things without proof. The real problem is what happens when you're correct and nobody believes you. Think about the last time you sensed something off about a person everyone else loved. Maybe it was a new coworker who seemed charming to everyone, but gave you this specific feeling of wrongness. Not dislike, not jealousy. Just this quiet certainty that something beneath the surface didn't match the performance. You probably stayed quiet because you couldn't point to evidence. You couldn't say, here's the exact moment they revealed themselves, because there was no moment. It was an accumulation of tiny behavioral inconsistencies your unconscious mind cataloged while your conscious mind was doing something else entirely. Then 6 months later, that person's mask slips. The thing you knew turns out to be accurate, and nobody remembers that you saw it first. Nobody connects your early withdrawal from that person to the truth that eventually surfaced. You were right. But being right without proof at the time means you get no credit for the prediction. You just look lucky. Or worse, you look like you're retroactively claiming insight you never had. This is the isolation of accurate intuition. You live in a world where most people need evidence before belief. But your cognitive process delivers belief before evidence. You're out of sync with how social trust operates. People trust what they can verify. You trust what your pattern recognition shows you. These two systems don't speak the same language. Let me explain what's actually happening in your brain when you just know something about another person. Your INTP cognitive stack leads with introverted thinking, which means you're constantly building and refining internal logical frameworks. These frameworks aren't just about abstract concepts. They include behavioral models, psychological patterns, and social dynamics. Every interaction you observe updates these models. Every conversation adds data points. You're not consciously doing this. Your mind does it automatically, the same way your visual cortex processes light without you thinking about it. When you meet someone new, your brain runs their behavior against these established patterns. It's checking for consistency. It's looking for gaps between what they say and what they signal non-verbally. It's comparing their stated values to their revealed priorities. This happens so fast that the output arrives as a feeling, a hunch, a knowing. You don't see the processing, you only see the result. But here's where it gets complicated. Because you lead with thinking rather than feeling, you don't trust your own emotional responses the way other types might. When you get a bad feeling about someone, your first instinct isn't to honor that feeling. Your first instinct is to question it. You ask yourself if you're being fair, if you're projecting, if you're letting some irrelevant bias corrupt your assessment. You subject your intuition to logical scrutiny, which is actually healthy most of the time, but it creates this strange situation where you know something and simultaneously doubt that you know it. This is different from how other intuitive types operate. An INFJ might trust their read on a person immediately because their feeling function validates it. An ENTP might voice their suspicion right away because their extroverted intuition enjoys exploring possibilities out loud. But you sit with it, you test it, you watch for confirming or disconfirming evidence. You stay quiet because premature accusation feels intellectually dishonest when you can't cite your sources. The problem is that staying quiet has costs. When you sense something wrong about a person and you don't speak up, you're making a choice. You're prioritizing social harmony or intellectual honesty over what your pattern recognition is telling you. Sometimes that's the right call. Sometimes that person you had a bad feeling about turns out to be fine, and you're glad you didn't say anything. But sometimes they're not fine. Sometimes they hurt people you care about. And you have to live with the fact that you saw it coming and said nothing because you couldn't prove it yet. This creates a specific kind of guilt that's hard to explain to people who don't experience this type of knowing. It's not the guilt of having done something wrong. It's the guilt of having known something true and not acted on it because the truth arrived through a channel other people don't recognize as valid. You feel responsible for outcomes you couldn't have prevented without sounding paranoid or judgmental. That's a lonely position to occupy. Now let's talk about what happens when you do speak up, when you do try to warn someone about something you can't prove yet. You've probably learned this doesn't go well. The person you're warning usually reacts defensively. They ask you what evidence you have. You explain that you don't have evidence exactly. You just notice patterns that concern you. They hear that as, "I have a bad feeling," which sounds subjective and unreliable. They might even get angry with you for judging someone based on vibes rather than facts. Here's what they don't understand. Your vibes are facts. They're just facts processed through a cognitive mechanism that operates below conscious awareness. When a doctor looks at a patient and knows something is wrong before the tests come back, we call that clinical experience. When a master chess player sees a winning move without calculating every variation, we call that expertise. But when you look at a person and know something about their character before they reveal it publicly, people call it presumption. They call it jumping to conclusions. They don't recognize pattern recognition as a legitimate way of knowing when it's applied to human behavior. This is partly because human behavior is complex, and people are uncomfortable with the idea that they might be predictable. We all like to think of ourselves as unique and inscrutable. The possibility that someone could read us accurately without us explicitly revealing ourselves feels invasive. It threatens our sense of privacy and control. So when you demonstrate this ability, even indirectly, people often respond with skepticism or hostility. They're protecting their self-concept, but you're not trying to invade anyone's privacy. You're just noticing what's already visible. You're reading public behavior and drawing logical conclusions. The fact that you're accurate doesn't make you intrusive. It makes you observant. There's a difference. The challenge is that accuracy without proof puts you in impossible social positions. If you're wrong, you look paranoid and judgmental. If you're right, you look like you were keeping dangerous information to yourself. Either way, you lose. This is why many INTPs eventually stop sharing these observations altogether. You learn that your pattern recognition creates more problems than it solves in social contexts, so you keep it to yourself. You watch things unfold the way you knew they would, and you say nothing. That silence has psychological costs. When you consistently suppress accurate observations because they're socially inconvenient, you start to distrust your own mind. You begin second-guessing insights that are actually correct. You develop this internal split where part of you knows something and another part of you insists that knowing is impossible without evidence. That split creates cognitive dissonance. It's exhausting to live in a state where your most reliable analytical tool is also the one you're least allowed to use openly. Over time, this can lead to a kind of epistemic learned helplessness. You stop trusting your reads on people even when they're accurate because you've been socially punished for acting on them too many times. You start treating your pattern recognition as unreliable, which means you miss things you would have caught earlier. Your accuracy declines not because your cognitive ability has weakened, but because you've trained yourself not to use it. You've internalized other people's skepticism about your process. This is particularly difficult because your thinking function craves precision and reliability. When you can't count on your own analytical tools, you lose confidence in your ability to navigate social reality. You might withdraw further. You might stop trying to connect with people because you can't reconcile what you observe with what you're socially permitted to acknowledge. That withdrawal looks like social anxiety or introversion on the surface, but underneath it's often just frustration with the gap between what you see and what you're allowed to say. There's another layer to this that's worth examining. When you know things about people without proof, you're not just observing them, you're also making predictions about how they'll behave in future situations. Your pattern recognition doesn't just tell you who someone is now, it tells you who they're likely to become under pressure. You can often see someone's breaking point before they reach it. You can anticipate betrayals before they happen. You can sense when someone's about to make a destructive choice. This predictive capacity is valuable, but it's also burdensome. Because once you see where someone is headed, you have to decide whether to intervene. An intervention is tricky when you're working from pattern recognition rather than concrete evidence. If you warn someone they're about to make a mistake and they ignore you, you've spent social capital for nothing. If you don't warn them and they make the mistake anyway, you carry the guilt of having seen it coming. There's no clean answer to this dilemma. You can't save people from themselves, especially when they're not ready to hear what you're seeing. But watching someone you care about walk toward predictable disaster while you stay silent because you can't prove the disaster is coming yet is its own kind of torture. You're trapped between two bad options: speak and be dismissed, or stay quiet and watch it happen. The most functional approach I've seen INTPs develop is selective disclosure. You learn to identify who in your life can handle your pattern recognition and who can't. Some people are open to your observations even when you can't fully explain them. These people have usually seen you be right enough times that they trust your process even when they don't understand it. With these people, you can share what you're noticing. You can say, "I don't have proof yet, but something about this situation concerns me," and they'll take that seriously. Other people will never trust your pattern recognition. They need evidence before belief, and no amount of demonstrated accuracy will change that. With these people, you have to accept that your observations won't be valued until events prove them correct. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you're working with incompatible epistemologies. They need to see the proof. You need to see the patterns. Neither approach is superior. They're just different. The key is not forcing your process on people who can't receive it. That doesn't serve them, and it doesn't serve you. It just creates conflict and reinforces the idea that your pattern recognition is unreliable, when actually it's just being applied in contexts where it won't be recognized. What you can do is develop your ability to articulate the specific observations that feed your conclusions. Even when you can't explain the full chain of reasoning, you can usually point to some of the data points your unconscious mind used. Instead of saying, "I have a bad feeling about this person," you can say, "I noticed they interrupted you 3 times in that conversation," or "their story about their last job had some inconsistencies," or "they reacted defensively when you asked a straightforward question." These concrete observations don't fully explain your conclusion, but they give people something tangible to consider. They bridge the gap between your internal process and external verification. This isn't about justifying yourself, it's about translation. You're translating from a language of patterns to a language of evidence. You're making your invisible process visible, at least partially. This takes practice because you're not used to breaking down what happens automatically. But it's a learnable skill, and it makes your insights more accessible to people who think differently than you do. You also need to give yourself permission to be wrong sometimes. Your pattern recognition is highly accurate, but it's not infallible. You're working with incomplete information and probabilistic conclusions. Sometimes the pattern you're seeing is real, but gets disrupted by factors you couldn't have predicted. Sometimes you misread a situation because you were missing context. That's not a failure of your cognitive process. That's just the nature of prediction. Even accurate models produce false positives occasionally. The goal isn't perfect accuracy. The goal is calibration. You want to understand the confidence level of your observations. Some things you know with near certainty. Other things are educated guesses. Learning to distinguish between these levels of confidence helps you decide when to speak up and when to keep watching. High confidence observations might be worth voicing even without proof. Lower confidence observations might be worth noting mentally, but not acting on until you have more data. This calibration also protects you from the cognitive distortion of thinking you're always right just because you're often right. That's a trap some INTPs fall into. They get so used to their pattern recognition being accurate that they stop questioning it. They start treating their hunches as certainties. That leads to overconfidence and eventually to significant errors. Maintaining epistemic humility, recognizing that you're working with strong probabilities rather than absolute certainties, keeps your analytical tools sharp. One of the most valuable things you can do is find other people who share this cognitive style. Other INTPs or people with similar pattern recognition abilities. These relationships are valuable because you don't have to explain or justify your process. You can say, "Something about this doesn't add up," and the other person will understand you're describing a real observation, not a vague feeling. You can test your reads against theirs. You can develop shared language for describing patterns that are hard to articulate. These relationships also provide validation that your experience is real. When you spend most of your time around people who don't recognize pattern recognition as legitimate, you can start to feel like something is wrong with you, like you're making things up or being paranoid. Having even one person who confirms that they see what you see, who experiences the same type of knowing, reminds you that your cognitive process is valid. It's not weird, it's not broken, it's just different from the majority approach. Understanding the psychology behind why you just know things doesn't make the social challenges disappear. You'll still face skepticism. You'll still have moments where you're right, but can't prove it yet. You'll still have to decide when to speak and when to stay quiet. But understanding what's actually happening in your mind when these insights arrive gives you a framework for working with them instead of against them. Your pattern recognition is a tool. Like any tool, it has appropriate and inappropriate applications. It works best when you're observing behavior over time rather than making snap judgments from single interactions. It works best when you're open to updating your conclusions as new information arrives. It works best when you can separate your analysis of what someone is doing from your judgment of who they are as a person. Behavior patterns don't define someone's entire character, they just reveal current psychological dynamics. You're not better than other people because you have this ability. You're not more perceptive or more intelligent, you just process social information differently. Your brain prioritizes pattern detection over social harmony. That's not a moral virtue, it's a cognitive style. It has advantages and disadvantages like any other approach to understanding the world. The disadvantage is the isolation that comes from seeing things others don't see yet. The advantage is the clarity that comes from accurate social perception. You navigate relationships with more information than most people have access to. You can protect yourself from harmful dynamics earlier. You can identify genuine people more quickly. You can make better decisions about who to trust and who to keep at a distance. That's not nothing. That's actually quite valuable. The challenge is learning to trust it without becoming arrogant about it. Learning to use it without alienating people who don't share your process. Learning to live with the loneliness of accurate observation while still maintaining connections with people who think differently than you do. So here's what I want to know from you. When was the last time you knew something about someone that turned out to be completely accurate? But at the time you had no proof and couldn't explain how you knew. What happened when you tried to share that observation, or what stopped you from sharing it? Drop your experience in the comments because I think we need to talk about this more openly. This isn't mystical. This isn't paranormal. This is cognitive science that hasn't caught up with lived experience yet, and your stories matter in understanding how this actually works in real life.